Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our channel. I'm thrilled you could join us for another deep dive into one of history's most transformative events, the Russian Revolution. Today, we will journey through the dark and tumultuous days of the Romanov dynasty's collapse and the birth of a new world. But before we get into it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode of our historical storytelling. Now, let's begin. The year is 1917, and Russia stands on the brink of a monumental transformation. A vast land, stretching from the frozen tundra of Siberia to the palatial streets of St. Petersburg. Russia has long been governed by the Romanov dynasty. For over 3 centuries, the Romanovs, with their ironclad grip on power, have ruled with absolute authority, embodying the grandeur of the Russian Empire. Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov line, symbolizes imperial power in a world that is beginning to change around him. But beneath the surface of this imperial world, discontent simmers like a slowly boiling pot. The people of Russia are suffering desperately. The peasants, who make up the majority of the population, live in abject poverty. Their land is barren, their work endless, and their lives uncertain. The factory workers, toiling in the growing industrial hubs of Petrograd and Moscow, face grueling conditions. They are overworked, underpaid, and treated as little more than cogs in the industrial machine. Then there is the military. Russia, once the mighty powerhouse of Europe, is crippled by the weight of World War I. The soldiers are weary, starved, and many have deserted. The once formidable Tsarist military is a shadow of its former self. The empire is rotting from within, and the cracks are beginning to show. By February 1917, the situation in Petrograd, the heart of the empire, reaches a boiling point. Protests erupt as workers, soldiers, and ordinary citizens fill the streets, demanding an end to the war and the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. It's not just one protest, but a wave of unrest that sweeps across the city. What begins as a small demonstration rapidly snowballs into a full-blown revolution. The Tsar, previously seen as the divine ruler of the Russian people, is now perceived as the embodiment of their suffering. The chants grow louder. Down with the Tsar, and bread for the people. The anger is palpable, and the cries for change reverberate through the streets. Within days, the protests have gained unstoppable momentum. Workers from the factories pour into the streets, while soldiers, tired of their own hardships, side with the revolutionaries. The capital is engulfed in a whirlwind of revolutionary fervor. The monarchy that has ruled Russia for over 300 years is now teetering on the edge of collapse. The Tsar, unable to control the tide of revolution, is forced to abdicate. His decision is swift, and the Romanov dynasty, one of the longest reigning monarchies in Europe, falls with a thud. Nicholas II, once anointed by God to rule, is now powerless. The empire he has ruled for his entire life fades into history. The monarchy, the foundation of Russia's identity for centuries, is no more. But the fall of the Romanovs is just the beginning of a new chapter in Russian history. The people, emboldened by their victory, now face an uncertain future. Who will take the reins of power? Who will lead Russia out of its suffering and into a new era? In the chaos that follows, a vacuum of power emerges. The provisional government steps into the void, promising a better future. Composed of liberal reformers, it vows to enact change and restore Russia to its former glory. The new leaders speak of freedom, democracy, and the rights of the people. Yet, despite their lofty promises, the provisional government proves to be weak, divided, and ineffective. It fails to address the fundamental needs of the people. The war continues, draining Russia's resources and morale. The peasants remain landless. The workers continue to suffer, and the soldiers are still stuck in the trenches. The provisional government is unable to bring the radical change that Russia so desperately needs. Its promises ring hollow in the face of the country's real struggles. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the revolution, another force is quietly gathering strength. The Bolsheviks, a radical faction of socialists led by the brilliant and unyielding Vladimir Lenin, see an opportunity. Lenin, a man of vision and uncompromising belief in Marxism, returns to Russia from exile in April 1917. The people, weary of half measures and false promises, begin to listen. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, offer an alternative: peace, land, and bread. These simple words resonate deeply with the suffering masses. The workers and peasants, hungry for change, flock to the Bolshevik banner. Lenin's promises of an end to the war, land redistribution, and food for the people sound like a beacon of hope in the midst of despair. As the summer of 1917 fades into autumn, the Bolshevik movement gains momentum. Lenin's words, fueled by the anger and desperation of the people, stir the hearts of workers, soldiers, and peasants alike. The provisional government, increasingly seen as ineffective and weak, is now under threat. The Bolsheviks see their moment and strike. In October, with military precision and ruthless resolve, Lenin and his comrades seize control of Petrograd. In the dead of night, Bolshevik forces, led by Lenin's loyal general, Leon Trotsky, storm the Winter Palace. They take the heart of the provisional government by surprise, capturing key positions throughout the city. The government falls without much resistance, and the Bolsheviks seize power. The world watches, astonished. Russia, once the proud empire of the Tsars, is now a Soviet state. The monarchy is dead, and a new order has emerged. The revolution is over, but the struggle is far from finished. Lenin and the Bolsheviks now face the enormous task of consolidating power, keeping the revolution alive, and transforming Russia into the socialist utopia they have promised. But the path ahead is fraught with challenges. The provisional government has fallen, but the country is plunged into chaos. A bitter civil war erupts as the Red Army, loyal to the Bolsheviks, clashes with the White Army, a coalition of monarchists, capitalists, and anti-Bolshevik forces. The war is brutal, and the stakes are high. The Bolsheviks must fight not only for survival but for the future of the revolution. As the conflict intensifies, Lenin's vision of a socialist future begins to take shape. The new government nationalizes the land, redistributes wealth, and begins to implement a series of radical economic reforms. Yet, with the promises of a new world come sacrifices. The revolution, once a beacon of hope, begins to reveal its darker side. The Red Terror, a campaign of political repression, begins as the Bolsheviks move swiftly to eliminate any opposition to their rule. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, is formed to root out counter-revolutionaries and enemies of the state. Thousands are imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The dream of a utopian society becomes increasingly intertwined with fear, violence, and authoritarianism. As the Russian people endure the brutal realities of the Civil War, they cling to the hope that the revolution will ultimately deliver the equality and prosperity they have been promised. But in the midst of war and bloodshed, it becomes increasingly clear that the price of revolution is steep. The promises of peace, land, and bread may have resonated in the beginning, but now the reality of building a new world from the ashes of the old empire is proving to be far more complicated than anyone imagined. The Soviet Union, forged in the fires of revolution, begins to take shape. The revolution's ideals of equality, justice, and workers' control will now be put to the test. But the path ahead is uncertain, and the dream of a socialist utopia faces tremendous obstacles. The Russian people, who once celebrated the fall of the Tsars, now find themselves caught in a new struggle, one that will shape the course of history for decades to come. As the winter of 1917 turns to spring, and the revolution begins to settle into the harsh reality of war and political turmoil, one thing becomes certain: the Russian Revolution has irrevocably altered the course of Russian history, and the world will never be the same. As the great Russian Empire teeters on the brink of a new era, a small yet determined group of revolutionaries silently positions themselves to seize the moment. Among them, one figure stands out: Vladimir Lenin, a man of sharp intellect, unwavering resolve, and a dream of a radically different world. Lenin has spent years in exile, plotting, thinking, and waiting. From the safety of foreign lands, he has watched the crumbling of the Tsarist regime, knowing the revolution was inevitable. But now, the time has finally come. The provisional government, the interim authority that has taken control after the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, remains weak, unable to provide the radical change the Russian masses so desperately crave. This is the opening Lenin has been waiting for. Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917 is nothing short of dramatic. After a long exile filled with struggle, imprisonment, and perseverance, he steps off the train in Petrograd with a single-minded determination. His arrival is greeted with awe, anticipation, and hope. Lenin, who had spent years exiled from his homeland, was now back to lead his revolution. He is met by a country exhausted from years of war and internal strife. The people are hungry, not just for food, but for change. The provisional government, despite its promises of reform, has failed to end the war, failed to meet the basic needs of the masses, and has failed to give the workers and peasants the justice they demand. The slogans of the revolution echo in the streets, but it is Lenin's voice that rises above the rest. His speeches are fire itself, a blistering critique of the old order, and an urgent plea for a new world. Peace, bread, and land, he proclaims, and the crowds listen. These are not just words. These are the dreams of the workers, the soldiers, the peasants' people who have been ground down by years of war, poverty, and inequality. Lenin's words resonate deeply. They have waited for this moment, and now, in the clarity of his vision, they begin to see a way out of the darkness. But Lenin's vision is not one born out of simple hope. He has a deep and abiding belief in the power of the people. His slogan, "All power to the Soviets," speaks directly to the workers and soldiers, to the councils of workers and peasants that have sprung up throughout the country. The Soviets represent the raw, unrefined power of the revolution, the direct will of the people. Lenin's ideology, influenced by Marxism, demands that this power be transferred from the corrupt elite to the workers themselves. This message, though radical, is what the masses have been waiting for. It is not just a call for the redistribution of power, but for the redistribution of life itself. Lenin promises a world free of exploitation, a world where the worker is no longer a mere cog in the machine, where inequality is vanquished and peace is no longer a dream, but a reality. What had once been a fringe movement, a small group of revolutionaries operating in the shadows, suddenly begins to grow. The Bolshevik Party, led by Lenin, rapidly gains strength as its message of radical change reverberates across the streets of Petrograd. The party's promises of a world free from exploitation, inequality, and endless war begin to strike a chord with the masses. It is no longer a question of whether the revolution will succeed, but when. The Bolsheviks are no longer an isolated group. They are a growing force with the potential to reshape the future of Russia and beyond. Petrograd, the epicenter of revolutionary fervor, becomes a city of anticipation and unrest. The air is thick with a sense of purpose and expectation. In the crowded streets, workers gather in factories, discussing the future. They are tired of the old ways, tired of the promises that never came to fruition. Their loyalty, once given to the provisional government, is now shifting. Their faith is no longer in the men who sit in palatial offices far removed from the realities of life in the factories and fields. Instead, their loyalty is being drawn toward the Bolsheviks. Soldiers, weary from the endless trenches of the Great War, return from the front, their morale shattered. Many of them, like the workers, are now disillusioned with the promises of the provisional government. It is to the Bolsheviks they turn, finding comfort and hope in Lenin's vision of peace and justice. The city pulsates with the energy of change, as if every cobblestone and every whisper in the alleyways carries the weight of history in the making. Meetings and rallies become commonplace, with impassioned speeches echoing through the air, stirring the hearts of those who listen. The once muted voices of the disenfranchised now roar with a newfound confidence, each individual feeling a part of something momentous. In the cafes and taverns, debates rage late into the night, as scholars, workers, and soldiers alike contemplate the implications of this seismic shift. The newspapers, often the only source of information for many, are filled with both fervent support and vehement opposition, each side vying to capture the soul of the nation. As the chill of autumn descends upon Petrograd, the tension thickens. The streets, illuminated by flickering gas lamps, seem to vibrate with anticipation. Rumors swirl of impending action, of a decisive moment that will tip the scales irrevocably. The world watches with bated breath, aware that the outcome of this struggle will ripple far beyond the borders of Russia. In these tumultuous times, the people of Petrograd stand on the precipice of a new era. The choices made in the days to come will not only define the fate of a nation, but will also echo through the annals of history, shaping the very course of the 20th century. As the first snowflakes begin to fall, covering the city in a silent white cloak, the stage is set for the final act of a drama that has been unfolding for months. The revolution is not just an event, it is a transformation, a rebirth, and, for many, a beacon of hope in a world yearning for change. But amidst this fervor, Lenin and his comrades know they must act. Their words alone are not enough. They must organize, and they must act decisively. The revolution, Lenin believes, cannot be allowed to slip away into uncertainty. So, the Bolsheviks begin to work tirelessly. Meetings are held in secret, whispered in dimly lit rooms. Pamphlets are printed in the dead of night, carried by hand to the workers and soldiers. Speeches are made on street corners, in factories, in every public square. The city becomes a cauldron of revolutionary activity, with every passing day bringing new developments, new revelations, and a growing sense that change is coming. Change that is as inevitable as the rising Sunday. As the months pass, the Bolshevik movement gathers momentum. By the time autumn arrives, the party has grown into a formidable force, its followers swelling in number. Lenin, once a figure operating in the shadows, is now at the forefront of the revolution. The Bolsheviks are prepared to strike when the moment is right, and the moment, they believe, has arrived. The provisional government is weak, divided, and unable to fulfill its promises. Its authority is slipping. It cannot control the growing tide of revolutionary fervor sweeping the country. The workers and soldiers, now fully behind the Bolsheviks, are ready to seize power. The October Revolution is meticulously planned. Lenin, who has carefully studied the revolutionary history of the world, understands that timing is everything. He knows that any misstep could cost the Bolsheviks everything. The city of Petrograd is the key, and its government buildings, communication centers, and infrastructure must be seized in a swift, decisive strike. On the night of October 25th, 1917, the Bolsheviks moved. Under the cover of darkness, they begin to take key locations. The Winter Palace, the symbol of the old regime, is their primary target. They strike with military precision. The provisional government, caught off guard and disorganized, is unable to mount a defense. The revolution, once a distant dream, becomes a living, breathing reality. The Bolsheviks take control of Petrograd, and by dawn, they have seized the heart of the provisional government. The world watches in stunned silence. Russia, the great empire that once spanned continents, is now a socialist state. The monarchy is no more, and the promise of a new order has arrived. But while the Bolsheviks are victorious, they know that their work is far from finished. The revolution has only just begun. The victory is sweet, but it is fleeting. The Bolsheviks now face the monumental task of consolidating power, of building the society they have promised. The world looks on with a mix of awe and trepidation. The old order has been destroyed, but what will rise in its place? Lenin, Trotsky, and the other Bolshevik leaders are determined to build the new socialist state, but they are also aware of the dangers that lie ahead. The promise of peace, bread, and land must be delivered, or the revolution risks being undone. The revolution's ideals, equality, justice, and a world without war must now be made real. It is a task that will take years of struggle, hardship, and sacrifice. The world is watching, waiting to see if this bold experiment will succeed or collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The birth of the Soviet Union is a moment of both hope and uncertainty. It is the dawn of a new era, one that will change the course of history forever. The Bolsheviks have won the battle, but the war for the soul of the revolution is just beginning. As the dust settles and the reality of the new order begins to take shape, one question looms large. Will the promises of the revolution be fulfilled, or will they crumble beneath the weight of power, fear, and betrayal? Only time will tell. The early morning of the 25th of October 1917 would go down in history as a momentous turning point not just for Russia, but for the world. As the chill of autumn settled over Petrograd, the capital of the Russian Empire, a new chapter of history began to unfold. The Bolsheviks, led by the determined Vladimir Lenin, were about to seize power in a revolution that would forever reshape the course of human civilization. At the heart of this turmoil, Lenin stood with unshakable confidence, flanked by his comrades, including the fiery and strategic Leon Trotsky. Together, they had spent years preparing for this moment, the moment when they would strike and take the reins of a nation that had long been under the control of the Romanovs and their corrupt, ineffective rulers. The provisional government, established after the February Revolution, was a fragile and divided body, unable to quell the unrest that had been brewing in Russia for years. Despite their promises of reform, they had failed to end the war, address the suffering of the workers and peasants, or restore stability. With the people disillusioned and the army exhausted, the Bolsheviks knew the time had come to act. For months, Lenin and Trotsky had been laying the groundwork for revolution's secret meetings, pamphlets distributed in the dead of night, and speeches in factories and barracks had all prepared the way for the ultimate strike. The revolution would come not with the sound of marching armies or the eruption of violent clashes, but with a calculated, methodical assault on the institutions of the old regime. The Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government, and the symbolic heart of the Tsarist autocracy, became the focal point of the Bolshevik Revolution. It was a grand, imposing structure, a symbol of imperial power and dominance, but it would soon become a hollow shell, overtaken by the forces of change. Trotsky and his Red Guards, with a combination of military discipline and revolutionary zeal, began to mobilize in the early hours of October 25. The streets of Petrograd were quiet, the night still and dark, but there was an electricity in the air, as though the city itself held its breath. The Winter Palace, surrounded by a web of guards and soldiers, was a fortress that would not fall easily. But the Bolsheviks were prepared. The operation was swift and effective, carried out with such precision that the provisional government had no chance to mount any meaningful defense. As dawn broke over Petrograd, the city was irrevocably changed. The Red Guards, guided by Trotsky's strategic brilliance, took control of key bridges, railway stations, and telegraph offices, cutting off any possible reinforcements and communication with loyalist forces. The Winter Palace, though heavily guarded, was soon breached. The provisional government, caught off guard, found themselves surrounded and powerless to resist the tide of revolution sweeping through their ranks. Inside the palace, chaos reigned as ministers attempted to escape or destroy incriminating documents. But it was too late. The Bolsheviks, relentless and organized, quickly secured the building, arresting the remaining members of the provisional government. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the golden spires of the city, it became clear that the old order had crumbled. The people of Petrograd took to the streets, celebrating the dawn of a new era, their hopes for a better future ignited by the victory of the revolutionaries. Across Russia, news of the Bolshevik triumph spread like wildfire. Workers and soldiers, inspired by the events in Petrograd, began to seize control of factories, barracks, and government offices, aligning themselves with the new revolutionary government. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and Trotsky, set about the monumental task of reshaping society, driven by their vision of a world built on equality and justice. The October Revolution, as it came to be known, marked the beginning of a new chapter in Russian history. It was a time of great upheaval and transformation, as the Bolsheviks endeavored to construct a socialist state. Challenges lay ahead, from internal dissent to external threats, but for the moment, The promise of a better world shone brightly in the hearts of the people. The revolution had succeeded, and with it, a new Russia was born. By the time the first rays of dawn began to pierce the horizon, the Bolsheviks had taken control of key government buildings, communication centers, and military strongholds. The Winter Palace was stormed, and inside, the last remnants of the provisional government surrendered without a fight. The crumbling remnants of the old order, once seen as an immovable power, had fallen to a group of revolutionaries who had been, just months before, a small fringe faction on the periphery of Russian politics. The Bolsheviks had triumphed, but as the revolutionaries raised their banners and celebrated their newfound power, they knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult struggle. The October Revolution was not merely a shift in power, it was a radical transformation of Russian society. The Bolsheviks had a grand vision: to create a world where workers controlled the means of production, where the land was redistributed to the peasants, and where the shackles of imperialism and capitalism would be thrown off for good. It was a vision that promised a fairer, more just society, a vision that could only be realized if the revolution succeeded in securing both internal stability and external support. As Lenin stood at the helm, he was keenly aware of the challenges that lay ahead. The revolution had been won in Petrograd, but Russia was a vast land, and the reach of the Bolsheviks' influence was still limited. Not everyone in the country welcomed the new regime with open arms. The industrialists, landowners, and remnants of the aristocracy all had a vested interest in seeing the revolution fail, and, more immediately, the country was at war. The Bolsheviks had promised to pull Russia out of the disastrous conflict of World War I, but this would be easier said than done. There were millions of soldiers and commanders who still pledged their loyalty to the old regime and to the idea of Russian nationalism. The old Russian Empire was dying, but its lingering vestiges would not go quietly. Even as the Bolsheviks celebrated their victory, a civil war loomed on the horizon. The White Army, a loose coalition of monarchists, capitalists, and anti-Bolshevik forces, began to organize and march against the revolutionaries. The Reds, as the Bolsheviks were now called, would be forced to fight not just for control of the capital, but for their very survival. It would be a war that would tear the country apart for the next several years. But in the midst of this uncertainty, there was also hope. The Russian people, particularly the workers and peasants who had borne the brunt of the old regime's oppression, looked to the Bolsheviks as their liberators. They had seen the failures of the provisional government, and now they saw the possibility of a society that might finally fulfill their needs and dreams. The promise of peace, land, and bread had ignited the flames of revolution, and now, in the wake of the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks began to fulfill those promises. Land redistribution was one of the first major reforms to be implemented. The vast estates of the nobles and the church were seized and divided among the peasants, who had long been enslaved to the whims of the aristocracy. The workers, too, saw their lives begin to change as the Bolsheviks took steps to nationalize industry and hand control of factories to the workers themselves. These were radical steps, and they were meant to signal to the world that the new Soviet government was serious about its goals. But as the months passed, the Bolsheviks found that the road to building a new society was not easy. The civil war raged across the countryside, and famine and disease began to take their toll. The economy, once robust, now lay in tatters. The Soviet government struggled to maintain control, even as it faced pressure from both external and internal enemies. The White Army, supported by foreign powers such as Britain, France, and the United States, was relentless in its quest to crush the revolution. The Bolsheviks, however, were not easily deterred. Despite their lack of resources and overwhelming odds, they fought on. They began to build a new army, an army of workers and peasants who were willing to defend their revolution at all costs. Inside the Bolshevik ranks, tensions began to surface. Not everyone agreed on the way forward. There were deep ideological divides between the various factions of the party. Lenin, Trotsky, and other key leaders differed on economic policy, military strategy, and the role of the state. These internal conflicts, though often hidden from the public eye, were a growing concern. The unity of the Bolshevik Party, built on a shared sense of urgency and purpose, began to fray. Despite the struggles and internal divisions, the Bolshevik Revolution had sparked something far greater than the change it brought to Russia alone. It set in motion a global movement, one that resonated with workers, peasants, and the oppressed across the world. The October Revolution inspired revolutionary movements in China, Cuba, and Vietnam. It became a symbol of resistance against imperialism, capitalism, and colonialism. The world, watching closely, would never be the same again. But back in Russia, the situation remained dire. The promise of a new world, a world where power belonged to the people, was still far from realization. The Bolsheviks would have to face challenges far greater than they had ever imagined. They would have to deal with the complex realities of war, revolution, and the harshness of governance. And yet, through it all, the revolutionaries held on to their dream, to create a society free from oppression, a society built on the ideals of equality and justice. In their hearts, they believed that the October Revolution had only just begun, and that the struggles they faced were part of the larger battle for the future of humanity. As the revolutionaries pressed forward, a new world slowly began to take shape. The chaos of war and rebellion would continue to ravage Russia, but in the hearts of those who fought for the revolution, there remained the enduring hope that someday the dream of a better world would be realized. The Russian Civil War, which raged from 1918 to 1921, was a brutal and bloody struggle, one that would not only define the future of Russia, but also the very fabric of the revolution. It was a war of survival, a contest not just for power, but for the soul of a nation. The stakes could not have been higher. On one side stood the Red Army, the army of the Bolsheviks, led by the indomitable Leon Trotsky, a man of fierce intellect and unparalleled military strategy. On the other side was the White Army, a collection of monarchists, capitalists, and anti-Bolshevik factions, all united in their desire to overthrow the fledgling Soviet government. The Whites were better equipped, better funded, and often more organized. Their ranks included former Tsarist officers who brought their experience to the battlefield, and they were supported by foreign powers who hoped to quash the revolution before it could spread. The war would not be a clean, clear-cut battle between good and evil. It would be a war of atrocities, with both sides committing heinous acts. It would leave the land of Russia scarred, its villages burned, its cities reduced to rubble, and its people broken. Millions of lives would be lost, and the country would be plunged into a darkness of suffering that seemed unrelenting. Entire regions were decimated as the battle between the Reds and the Whites tore through the Russian landscape. The economy, once the cornerstone of one of Europe's most powerful empires, lay in ruins. The revolution, which had promised a bright new future, had instead turned into a nightmare for many of those who had once supported it. Yet, despite these overwhelming challenges, the Bolsheviks held firm. Lenin's leadership, combined with Trotsky's military genius, ensured that the revolution survived the early years of the Civil War. The Red Army, though outgunned and outnumbered, fought not just for the preservation of power, but for the vision of a new world, a world in which the workers and peasants, those who had been oppressed for centuries, would hold the power. This was the dream that had inspired the revolution in the first place, and it was what kept the Red Army fighting on. But the reality of war, the cost of bloodshed, and the toll on the Russian people weighed heavily on the leaders. The revolution was being forged in blood. The dream of a better society, a society built on equality and justice, was beginning to feel like a distant memory as the violence and terror of the war became the day-to-day reality for millions of Russians. The country, once unified under the banner of imperialism, was now a divided and fragmented land. Cities that had once been centers of culture and progress were now ghost towns, their buildings smoldering ruins. Famine, disease, and poverty stalked the land. A generation of young men had been lost to the war, leaving behind a country of women, children, and the elderly who could only wonder when or if things would ever return to normal. And yet, amid this overwhelming chaos, Lenin's iron will held the revolution together. The new Bolshevik government, despite its early setbacks, began to implement sweeping reforms that would transform Russia. These reforms were necessary to secure the future of the revolution. Lenin was determined to consolidate power, but he knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. He was facing opposition not only from the White Army but also from dissenters within his own ranks. The party, once united by a shared belief in Marxist ideology, began to show signs of fracture as various factions vied for control. One of the most controversial aspects of Lenin's leadership during this period was the use of terror. In an effort to suppress any and all opposition to the Bolshevik regime, Lenin authorized the formation of the Cheka, a secret police force that would ruthlessly eliminate counter-revolutionaries, traitors, and anyone suspected of opposing the new government. The Cheka became infamous for its brutal methods, carrying out mass arrests, executions, and purges of those deemed to be enemies of the revolution. The revolution that had promised freedom and equality was becoming increasingly authoritarian, and many began to wonder whether the ends justified the means. The use of terror was not limited to the enemies of the Bolsheviks. As the Civil War raged on, the revolution began to turn inward. Internal dissent, which had once been viewed as part of the revolutionary process, was now being treated as an existential threat. The revolutionary spirit that had inspired the masses now seemed to be at odds with the realities of power. In the name of preserving the revolution, Lenin was willing to make brutal compromises. The ideals that had fueled the revolution, the promise of a society free from oppression, were becoming overshadowed by the demands of governing a fractured, war-torn nation. By 1921, the toll of the war had become undeniable. The land of Russia, once a vast empire teeming with life, was now a landscape of destruction. Cities that had once thrived with culture and industry were now smoldering ruins. Villages were abandoned, their people scattered, their homes destroyed. The economy was in shambles. The factories, the very backbone of the Bolshevik vision, were inoperative, their machines broken, their workers either dead or fleeing the front lines. The human cost was incalculable. It was a devastation that seemed to have no end. And yet, despite this, the Bolshevik government managed to retain control. They managed to stabilize critical regions and gradually reassert authority over the vast stretches of the country. They also began to introduce a policy of economic relief, a temporary retreat from the harshest ideals of socialism. This was the new economic policy, NEP, which allowed some private enterprise and market activity to re-enter the economy in an attempt to revive Russia's shattered economy. It was a pragmatic move, a retreat from the full-scale collectivism that had been the Bolshevik ideal, but it was necessary. The people were starving, and the country was on the verge of collapse. The NEP was a lifeline, but it was also a bitter pill for many of the more hardline revolutionaries within the Bolshevik Party. They had fought for a new world, one where private enterprise and capitalist exploitation were eliminated. The NEP, which allowed farmers and small traders to make a profit, felt like a betrayal of the revolution's promises. Yet, despite the growing tensions within the party, the Soviet Union managed to slowly recover. The Red Army, bolstered by Trotsky's leadership, managed to defeat the White Army and restore order. By the end of 1921, the Civil War was largely over. The Bolsheviks had triumphed, but the cost of that victory was staggering. The revolution had come at a terrible price, and it was clear that the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. The country was scarred, the people weary, and the leadership divided. As the Civil War ended, the Soviet Union began to emerge as a new entity on the world stage. The revolution had triumphed, but it had left deep scars on the Russian soul. The ideals that had inspired millions to rise up and overthrow the Tsarist regime were now in conflict with the reality of governing a country in ruin. The people, once hopeful for a better future, now questioned whether the revolution had truly been worth the cost. The war had shattered Russia's once proud identity, and the country now stood at a crossroads. The task ahead for the Bolshevik leadership was daunting. They needed to rebuild a nation from the ground up, while also navigating the complex web of international relations and internal dissent. The world watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as the Soviet Union sought to redefine itself and prove the viability of its revolutionary ideals. Internally, the NEP began to show signs of success. Agricultural output increased, markets buzzed with renewed activity, and a semblance of normalcy returned to everyday life. Cities that had been ravaged by war and famine slowly began to recover, and a cautious optimism emerged among the populace. Yet, beneath this surface of recovery, ideological tensions simmered. Within the Bolshevik Party, debates raged over the future direction of the Soviet state. Lenin, though pragmatic in his support for the NEP, faced criticism from those who feared that compromises would dilute the revolutionary spirit. Among them was Joseph Stalin, whose vision for the Soviet Union would soon cast a long shadow over its future. In this period of transition, art and culture also began to flourish, as artists and intellectuals grappled with the question of what it meant to be Soviet. The avant-garde movement, with its bold and experimental spirit, sought to capture the essence of the new society. Literature, theater, and cinema became arenas for exploring themes of identity, struggle, and the promise of a utopian future. Internationally, the Soviet Union's emergence posed a challenge to the existing world order. Other nations viewed the rise of a socialist state with a mix of fear and fascination, and diplomatic relations were cautiously forged. The Bolsheviks, keen to spread their revolutionary ideals, engaged in a complex dance of diplomacy and ideology. As the 1920 seconds unfolded, the Soviet Union continued to navigate these turbulent waters, seeking its place in a rapidly changing world. It was a time of hope and uncertainty, of rebuilding and reimagining, as the nation grappled with its past and looked toward its future, striving to forge a society that could live up to the ideals that had sparked the revolution. The Russian Civil War was not just a historical event, it was a profound lesson on the complexities of revolutionary change. It demonstrated that the path to transformation is never clear-cut, that the pursuit of justice can lead to violence, and that the promises of a better future can be clouded by the realities of power. The war would leave a legacy that would shape the course of the 20th century. The Soviet Union, born from the ashes of revolution, would go on to become a global superpower, but the scars of the Civil War would never fade. The struggle between ideals and the brutal realities of power would continue to haunt the Soviet government for decades to come. Amid the turbulent chaos of the Russian Civil War, as bombs exploded and the earth seemed to tremble beneath the weight of revolution, Vladimir Lenin remained unwavering. He was a man of relentless determination, not only bound to the survival of the Bolshevik Revolution, but to an even greater cause, the creation of a new socialist state. To Lenin, the Russian Revolution was not an isolated event. It was not merely the beginning of a new Russia. It was the spark that would ignite a global movement, the harbinger of change for the working class everywhere. He envisioned a world in which workers and peasants would rise up against the capitalist rulers, dismantle the oppressive systems, and replace them with a society based on equality, justice, and collective prosperity. It was an ambitious, audacious dream, and one that, in Lenin's eyes, was worth any sacrifice. The scope of Lenin's vision was radical, perhaps more so than anything that had come before. He didn't simply want to alter the political structure of Russia. He wanted to completely reshape society. He envisioned a government where power would be vested in the hands of the workers and peasants, who would be represented by the Soviets' workers' councils, formed from the very people who had suffered under the Tsarist regime and the capitalist system. These Soviets would form the backbone of the new state, bypassing traditional structures of governance and ensuring that the people would be the true rulers of the land. It was a vision of unprecedented equality, a state where economic power would no longer be concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy elites, but shared by all. In the early days following the revolution, Lenin and the Bolsheviks worked feverishly to implement policies that would reflect their radical ideals. The land, once owned by the aristocracy and the church, was seized and redistributed among the peasants. The factories, controlled by capitalists and industrialists, were nationalized and placed under the control of the workers. The economy, which had been in ruins due to years of war and mismanagement, was transformed into a system designed to serve the people and not the profit motives of a few. The revolution's ideals were being put into action, but at what cost? The country was bankrupt, its infrastructure destroyed, and the population was exhausted from years of conflict. The promises of a better world, though inspiring, were difficult to fulfill in a land so battered and broken. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Lenin pressed forward with his vision. He believed deeply in the power of the revolution, not just in Russia, but in the world. For him, the October Revolution was merely the first step toward a worldwide uprising. He was convinced that once the Russian workers and peasants saw the success of their revolution, they would inspire others around the globe to rise against their oppressors. He imagined a world in which capitalist empires crumbled and nations built upon socialist principles rose in their place. It was a grand vision, one that Lenin believed would ultimately reshape the entire world order. But the road to realizing this dream was fraught with obstacles. The Bolshevik government faced not only external opposition, but internal challenges as well. The country, shattered by years of war and revolution, was hardly in a position to build a new society. Resources were scarce, and the people were weary. There were food shortages, rampant inflation, and a general sense of disillusionment that threatened to undo the revolution. The workers and peasants, who had fought so valiantly for change, were beginning to question whether the promised utopia was ever going to materialize. Externally, the Soviet Union faced a growing hostility from foreign powers. The spread of communism was seen as a direct threat by capitalist nations, particularly those in Europe. Fearing the contagion of revolution, these powers sent military support to the White Army, hoping to crush the Bolshevik experiment before it could spread any further. At the same time, Lenin's dream of global revolution faced resistance from within the communist movement itself. Not all revolutionaries shared his vision. Some of the early leaders of the Bolshevik Party began to grow disillusioned with Lenin's methods. The brutality of the Civil War and the use of terror to suppress opposition had left a bitter taste for many who had once supported the revolution. The promise of equality was becoming tarnished by the realities of authoritarian rule. In the midst of all these trials, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921. The NEP was a pragmatic response to the immediate needs of the Soviet Union, a retreat from the extreme policies of war communism that had been implemented during the Civil War. Under the NEP, some degree of private enterprise was allowed to function once again, with peasants permitted to sell their surplus crops and small businesses allowed to reopen. This was a temporary measure, Lenin insisted, to stabilize the economy and ensure the survival of the new socialist state. It was a bold decision, one that angered many of Lenin's more hardline supporters, who saw it as a betrayal of the revolution's ideals. But Lenin, ever the pragmatist, understood that the future of the revolution depended on providing the people with some relief and rebuilding the shattered economy. Despite the controversy surrounding the NEP, the policy helped to bring some stability to the Soviet Union. It revitalized the agriculture and small-scale industries that had been decimated by the war and revolution. The famine that had plagued the land began to subside, and the economy slowly started to recover. However, this economic stabilization came at a cost. The temporary reintroduction of private capitalism, even on a small scale, was seen by some as a step backward, a compromise with the very forces the revolution had sought to overthrow. Lenin's critics, particularly within the Communist Party, voiced their concern that the NEP would lead to the resurgence of capitalist elements that had no place in a true socialist state. While the economic situation improved, Lenin's vision was not confined to mere economic policy. He had also called for a cultural revolution, one that would sweep away the old order and create a new, more just world. In the early years of the Soviet Union, there was an extraordinary flourishing of avant-garde art and literature. Artists, writers, and intellectuals were encouraged to experiment and express the ideals of socialism in their works. The revolution, Lenin believed, was not just a political transformation but a cultural one as well. Artists, free from the constraints of the old regime, could create works that challenged traditional ideas and expressed the vision of a future society built on collective harmony. Yet, as the years wore on, the challenges facing Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership became more pronounced. The Soviet Union, though recovering from the Civil War, was still isolated on the world stage. The threat of foreign intervention continued to hang over the revolution. Domestically, the revolutionaries who had once stood united were now split over the direction of the country. The cost of maintaining control was becoming evident, and as Lenin's health deteriorated, questions arose about the future of the Soviet Union. Lenin's vision for the future of socialism was still alive in the hearts of many, but the reality of governing a fractured, war-torn country was proving to be far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Amid this uncertainty, Lenin's health began to fail. After suffering a series of strokes, his once sharp mind grew clouded, and he found himself increasingly sidelined. The question of succession loomed large over the future of the Soviet state. Lenin had never named a clear successor, and with his health in decline, the power struggle within the Communist Party began to intensify. The two primary contenders to take his place were Leon Trotsky, the fiery revolutionary who had led the Red Army to victory in the Civil War, and Joseph Stalin, a man of ruthless ambition and political savvy. It was clear that Lenin's death would trigger a battle for control that would define the future of the Soviet Union. Lenin's vision had left an indelible mark on the world. His belief in the power of the working class to overthrow the capitalist system and build a just society had inspired millions of people across the globe. Yet, as his health deteriorated and the revolution entered a more uncertain phase, there were signs that the ideals of the revolution were becoming harder to maintain. The reality of power, the demands of governing a shattered nation, and the compromises necessary to survive had cast a shadow over the lofty promises of the revolution. As Lenin's legacy loomed large, the world watched, waiting to see how his vision would play out in the hands of those who would follow him. Would the dream of a socialist utopia endure, or would it fade under the weight of power and political infighting? Only time would tell. In the aftermath of the revolution, Lenin's vision for a socialist utopia became clearer and more distinct, but the means of achieving that vision grew increasingly contentious. The world that Lenin had promised one of equality, justice, and peace was far from being realized. Instead, the fledgling Soviet state was in a constant state of turmoil, beset by both internal and external enemies who were determined to crush the revolution. The provisional government had fallen, but the revolution's survival remained uncertain. Lenin, the brilliant architect of the revolution, found himself facing an urgent need to suppress opposition, both from counter-revolutionary forces and from within his own party. The Red Terror, which began in 1918, was a direct response to these threats. It was a period of extreme repression, a necessary evil in Lenin's eyes to protect the revolution at all costs. The Cheka, a ruthless secret police force, was tasked with rooting out and destroying any perceived enemies of the Bolshevik regime. Political opponents, former aristocrats, and even fellow Bolsheviks who dared to challenge Lenin's policies were targeted for imprisonment, torture, or execution. No one was safe. The revolution that had promised freedom from oppression now became one defined by fear and violence. The streets of Russia became stained with blood, and the ideals of the revolution, once celebrated as a beacon of hope, were slowly being eclipsed by the terror that the Bolsheviks used to secure their power. In the midst of the chaos, Lenin's health began to deteriorate. The weight of leading the revolution, coupled with his declining physical condition, began to show. The once energetic leader, who had stood at the helm of the revolution with unshakable resolve, now found himself weakened by strokes and illness. His leadership, though still formidable, was becoming less effective. As the years passed and Lenin's health continued to decline, the question of who would lead the Soviet Union after his death began to loom ever larger. The revolution, which had been sustained by the power of a single man's vision and determination, was now at a crossroads. It was during this time that one of the most notorious figures in Soviet history began to emerge: Joseph Stalin. A man of ruthless ambition and unyielding will, Stalin was not one to shy away from using any means necessary to seize and consolidate power. He had bided his time during the revolution, working his way into positions of influence within the party, while others, like Trotsky, had become the faces of the revolution. Stalin had quietly built a network of supporters within the Communist Party, the military, and the government. He was a master of political maneuvering, a man who knew how to exploit the weaknesses of others and turn situations to his advantage. As Lenin's health continued to fail, Stalin began his rise to power. The first target of his ambitions was Leon Trotsky, the popular and charismatic leader of the Red Army. Trotsky, who had been instrumental in the success of the revolution, was seen by many as Lenin's natural successor, but Stalin, determined to secure his own position, set about eliminating him. Using a combination of manipulation, deception, and outright force, Stalin turned the party apparatus against Trotsky. Eventually, Trotsky was exiled, and his influence waned as Stalin consolidated control over the Soviet state. With his rival removed, Stalin became the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union underwent a radical transformation. The ideals of the revolution, equality, justice, and collective ownership were increasingly subordinated to the needs of the state. As Stalin focused on building his own power and control, the revolution, which had once been about the people, now became about Stalin and the vision he sought to impose. His reign marked the beginning of a new chapter in Soviet history, one that would be defined by a brutal blend of industrialization, political repression, and intense state control. Stalin's policies, collectively known as Stalinism, emphasized rapid economic development at any cost. The Soviet Union, which had been an agrarian nation, was to be transformed into a global industrial power. Stalin's 5-year plans were aimed at achieving this transformation, focusing on the massive industrialization of the country. Factories were built, steel mills constructed, and workers were put to the task of building a new Soviet future. The cost of this rapid development was staggering. Workers were subjected to grueling hours, often in appalling conditions. The need for progress overrode any concern for the welfare of the workers themselves. The pursuit of industrialization came at the expense of human lives, as the country's economic growth was built on the backs of the Soviet people. But one of Stalin's most controversial and brutal policies was the collectivization of agriculture. Stalin sought to bring the country's agriculture under state control by forcefully consolidating small farms into collective ones. The goal was to increase agricultural productivity and feed the growing industrial workforce. However, the policy was disastrous. In many areas, peasants resisted the forced collectivization, and Stalin's response was brutal. The most tragic example of this was the famine in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor, where millions of people perished as a result of the Soviet government's policies. Grain was seized from the peasants, leaving them with little to survive on, and the state's refusal to send aid exacerbated the crisis. The famine was a direct consequence of Stalin's policies, and it left an indelible scar on the Soviet people. Yet Stalin's power only grew stronger as he fostered a culture of fear and loyalty through purges. The Great Purge, or the Great Terror, became one of the most infamous chapters of Stalin's rule. Beginning in the late 1932, Stalin launched a campaign of political repression aimed at eliminating any perceived threat to his authority. The purge targeted Communist Party members, military leaders, intellectuals, and anyone who might challenge Stalin's control. Thousands were arrested, imprisoned, and executed. The most notorious of these purges was the execution of many of Stalin's own allies, men who had been instrumental in the revolution. The purges were not confined to the elites. Ordinary citizens were caught up in the terror as well. Neighbors were encouraged to report each other, and the fear of being accused of treason permeated every level of Soviet society. Amidst the terror, the Soviet Union did experience significant advancements in science and technology. The state poured resources into the development of heavy industry, and the Soviet Union made strides in fields like space exploration and nuclear technology. The cultural sphere, however, was heavily censored and manipulated to serve state propaganda. Stalin sought to control every aspect of Soviet life, including the arts. Socialist realism became the dominant art form, with artists and writers required to produce works that glorified the state and depicted an idealized version of Soviet life. The cultural freedom that had existed during the early days of the revolution was long gone, replaced by state-sponsored art that reflected Stalin's vision of a perfect society. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, some artists and intellectuals managed to navigate the restrictions and find subtle ways to critique the regime or express more nuanced views. These acts of quiet defiance often went unnoticed by the authorities, but resonated deeply with those who longed for a more open and expressive culture. As World War II loomed on the horizon, Stalin's leadership faced its most formidable test. Initially caught off guard by the Nazi invasion in 1941, the Soviet Union suffered devastating losses. However, through sheer resilience and determination, the Soviet people turned the tide, playing a crucial role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. The war effort brought the country together in a way few other events had, creating a sense of unity and purpose that temporarily overshadowed the fear and repression of Stalin's domestic policies. In the post-war years, the Soviet Union emerged as a global superpower, its influence extending across Eastern Europe and beyond. However, the toll of Stalin's rule was profound. The human cost of his policies was incalculable, and the deep scars left by the purges and famines would take generations to heal. While Stalin is credited with transforming the Soviet Union into a major world power, his legacy is forever marred by the suffering and oppression endured by millions under his rule. The end of Stalin's life in 1953 brought about a period of de-Stalinization, as his successors sought to distance themselves from the excesses of his regime. This era opened the door to a gradual thaw in Soviet society, with more opportunities for cultural expression and a cautious easing of political repression. Yet, the shadow of Stalin's reign remained a powerful reminder of the perils of unchecked power and the importance of safeguarding human rights and freedoms. This period of Soviet history was marked by contradictions. On one hand, the Soviet Union became a formidable global force, achieving industrialization and military strength that could rival the West. On the other hand, the human toll of Stalin's policies was staggering. The purges, the forced labor camps, the famine, and the relentless repression left scars on the Soviet people that would endure for generations. Stalin's rule was a paradox, a blend of immense achievements and unspeakable atrocities. Underneath the veneer of a powerful state, the Soviet Union was a society marked by fear, mistrust, and suffering. As Stalin's influence continued to shape the Soviet Union, the world watched with a mixture of awe and fear. The Soviet Union, once an idealistic beacon of revolution, had now become a ruthless dictatorship, and Stalin's grip on power seemed unshakable. His legacy, however, would be one of profound complexity. While his policies would ultimately transform the Soviet Union into a global superpower, they also left an indelible mark on Russian history and the world. Stalin's reign would continue to shape the course of the 20th century. For better or worse, the horrors of his regime, though often overshadowed by his successes, would never be forgotten. The legacy of Stalinism, with its mix of industrialization and terror, would haunt the Soviet Union and its people for decades to come. As Lenin's health deteriorated, the world around him seemed to shift. The Bolshevik Revolution, which had erupted in a storm of fervor and sacrifice, continued to reshape not only Russia, but the very course of history itself. The Soviet Union, although battered and bruised from the brutal Civil War, was slowly and methodically beginning to rebuild. The dream of a new society, one built on socialist ideals of equality and justice, was no longer just a distant hope. It was becoming a reality, however imperfect, as the old world order, one defined by Tsarist autocracy and capitalist exploitation, gave way to something entirely new. But with Lenin increasingly incapacitated, there was a sense of urgency. He had been the driving force behind the revolution, the architect of this new world. Yet, even the greatest minds cannot escape the ravages of time. His health, long compromised by years of stress, exile, and the toll of leading a nation through war, now failed him completely. Lenin suffered a series of debilitating strokes, his once sharp mind clouded by the cruel encroachment of illness. As he lay in his room, increasingly withdrawn, the country began to realize that the man who had led them from the abyss of imperial rule into the uncertain light of revolution would not be there to see it through. In 1924, Lenin died. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union and the wider world. For a moment, the revolutionary spirit seemed to falter. Lenin had been a symbol of unyielding resolve, a beacon for the workers and peasants who had overthrown the Romanovs and established a new order. But as the Soviet Union plunged into mourning, it became clear that the revolution was not over. It was just entering a new phase. Lenin's death marked the end of an era. His legacy was already becoming complex. Some saw him as the embodiment of the revolution's ideals, a tireless advocate for the workers' right to self-determination. Others saw the darker side of his leadership, his willingness to use terror and repression to maintain control. the authoritarian nature that seemed to grow within the revolution as it faced greater and greater challenges. Nevertheless, his passing was a defining moment. It was the moment the revolution passed into the hands of those who would take it in directions that even Lenin could not have predicted. Enter Joseph Stalin, Lenin's successor, though not the man many had expected. Stalin was not a revolutionary firebrand like Trotsky, nor a charismatic leader like Lenin had been. He was a man of quiet, ruthless ambition, and he had been steadily consolidating power behind the scenes while others focused on more public struggles. Stalin's rise was less about ideology and more about pragmatism and manipulation. He understood the intricacies of party politics, the mechanisms of control, and the delicate balance between fear and loyalty. By the time Lenin's death created a vacuum, Stalin had already begun to position himself as the leader of the Soviet Union. While Lenin had seen the revolution as a global phenomenon, a spark to ignite the working class everywhere, Stalin saw it as a national project, one in which the Soviet Union must first establish itself as strong and united before reaching beyond its borders. Under Stalin's rule, the Soviet Union would undergo a dramatic transformation, but it would come at a tremendous human cost. Stalin's vision for the future was rooted in his obsession with power and control, both within the party and across the entire nation. Strength, unity, and industrial prowess would define the Soviet Union under his leadership, but so would fear, repression, and absolute loyalty to the state. The Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. The revolution had created a new world, but this new world was fragile, its foundations still in the process of being laid. The country's economy was devastated, its infrastructure in shambles. Stalin's vision was one of rapid transformation, where no sacrifice was too great and no setback too discouraging. He introduced the 5-year plan's ambitious goals to industrialize the nation, turning the Soviet Union from an agrarian society into a global industrial powerhouse. Factories sprang up across the country like iron giants, their smokestacks belching out the very symbol of progress. The land, once dominated by small, scattered farms, was now being collectivized in an effort to centralize agriculture under state control. It was a colossal task, one that would fundamentally alter the very fabric of Russian society. The countryside was swept up in the tide of collectivization, as peasants were forced to give up their private plots and join collective farms. This process was painful and violent. Millions of peasants resisted, and the state responded with ruthless efficiency. The famine in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor, was a direct consequence of these policies. Millions perished, their lives extinguished by Stalin's policies of forced collectivization and grain requisitioning. Yet, as suffering and death spread through the fields and villages, Stalin's grip on power only tightened. The 5-year plans, though they succeeded in rapidly industrializing the Soviet Union, also exposed the cost of progress. The lives of ordinary citizens were spent in grueling labor, working in unsafe conditions to fuel the ambitious industrial goals set by the government. The transformation of the Soviet Union into an industrial powerhouse came at the expense of human dignity and human life. The factories, the mines, the collective farms, they were not places of empowerment but of exploitation. People toiled away, their lives defined by quotas, their bodies breaking under the strain of relentless demands. The idealistic vision of a classless society began to feel like a distant, unreachable dream as Stalin's regime descended further into tyranny. Progress marched forward, but whispers of dissent began to echo throughout the corridors of power. Those who questioned Stalin's methods, or even his vision, were swiftly silenced. The purges, which had begun in the late 1932, were an attempt to root out any perceived threats to Stalin's rule. The Great Purge, or the Great Terror, swept through the country, targeting not just political opponents but anyone who was deemed an enemy of the state. Old Bolsheviks, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens found themselves caught in Stalin's web of fear. The purges were ruthless and swift, and the Soviet Union was plunged into a climate of paranoia and mistrust. Neighbors informed on neighbors, friends betrayed friends, even family members turned on each other in an effort to protect themselves from the ever-present threat of being labeled an enemy of the state. Despite the repression, Stalin's vision for the Soviet Union was being realized. The country emerged from the darkness of war and revolution into an industrialized powerhouse. Stalin's policies turned the Soviet Union into a formidable force, one that could rival the Western powers. But this success came at an enormous cost. The human toll of Stalin's policies was immeasurable. The purges, the famine, the forced labor camps, they all served to solidify Stalin's rule, but also scarred the Soviet people in ways that would take generations to heal. The ideals that had once fueled the revolution, equality, justice, freedom, were being overshadowed by the ruthless demands of the state. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, had become a paradox. It was a nation of great achievements, a global power capable of challenging the West, but it was also a nation defined by fear, oppression, and violence. While the Soviet people endured tremendous hardship, a sense of purpose lingered in the air. The dream of a classless society, a society in which the workers and peasants held power, was still alive in the hearts of many, even as the government's brutal tactics were used to maintain control. Some believed that the suffering would lead to a better tomorrow, a tomorrow where the promises of the revolution would be fully realized. Others, however, saw the revolution for what it had become, a movement hijacked by power-hungry men who had betrayed the ideals they once espoused. As the Soviet Union continued to evolve, the world watched with a mixture of awe and fear. The Soviet Union was rising as a global superpower, but its rise came at the expense of its own people. In this new world, possibilities and perils coexisted. The Soviet Union, forged in revolution and shaped by terror, stood as both a beacon of change and a warning. It was a testament to the transformative power of ideas, but also a chilling reminder of the lengths to which individuals would go to secure and maintain power. As the Soviet Union charted its course through uncharted waters, it laid the groundwork for a century that would be defined by ideological battles and the relentless pursuit of a more just society, however flawed and dangerous that pursuit might be. The legacy of the revolution, born in the blood of revolutionaries and the sacrifices of the masses, would echo through the decades, shaping the course of history for generations to come. The impact of the Russian Revolution rippled far beyond the snow-covered expanses of the Soviet Union, quickly spreading across the globe like an unstoppable tide. In the years following 1917, what began as an audacious bid to overthrow a centuries-old empire evolved into something much larger, a beacon of hope, yes, but also a symbol of profound upheaval. To many, it became the spark that ignited the flames of revolutions and uprisings around the world. From the far-flung corners of Asia to the heart of Latin America, the ideals of the Russian Revolution, workers' rights, anti-imperialism, and socialism quickly found their place among those fighting against centuries of colonial rule, inequality, and oppression. It was as though the world itself was being remade in the image of Bolshevik ideals. In China, the revolution was an especially potent force. Leaders like Mao Zedong, inspired by Lenin's writings and the success of the October Revolution, began to craft their own vision for a revolution that could overthrow the centuries-old feudal system and resist the encroachment of imperialist powers. The Chinese Communist Party, then a fledgling organization, found in the Russian example not just inspiration but a roadmap for the revolution they wished to bring about. Like the Bolsheviks before them, they believed that the oppressed peasants, long relegated to the margins of society, could be the agents of change. In Cuba, too, the revolution's flames took root, fanning the ambitions of revolutionaries such as Fidel Castro, who saw in the Soviet Union's success a challenge to the US-backed capitalist structures of Latin America. And in Vietnam, leaders like Ho Chi Minh looked to the Russian model as a way to resist the colonial forces of France, fueling their own struggle for independence. The influence of the Russian Revolution was not confined to political movements alone. It permeated cultural and intellectual realms as well. Writers, artists, and thinkers worldwide found themselves captivated by the revolutionary spirit, which promised a new dawn of creativity and freedom of expression. Avant-garde movements flourished, driven by the desire to break free from traditional constraints and explore bold, new ideas that mirrored the social transformations taking place. In Europe, the reverberations of the revolution could be felt in the burgeoning modernist movement, where artists and writers sought to capture the tumultuous energy of their times. Figures such as George Orwell and John Reed chronicled the events with a keen eye, offering both critique and admiration for the unfolding drama. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Harlem Renaissance was energized by the revolutionary ideals of equality and empowerment, providing a platform for African American voices to rise and resonate. As the world grappled with the changes wrought by the Russian Revolution, debates raged over its legacy. Supporters hailed it as a triumph for the downtrodden, a necessary upheaval that promised to dismantle oppressive systems and pave the way for a more just society. Critics, however, warned of the dangers of authoritarianism and the potential for new forms of tyranny to emerge from the ashes of the old order. Despite these differing perspectives, one thing was undeniable. The Russian Revolution had irrevocably altered the course of history, leaving an indelible mark on the 20th century. Its ideals continued to inspire and challenge, serving as both a cautionary tale and a source of hope for future generations, striving to create a more equitable world. The ideals of the Russian Revolution, anti-imperialism, socialism, and the call for the working class to seize control of their own destinies became a rallying cry across the globe. It was a cry of liberation that resonated from the fields of China to the mountains of Cuba. In every corner of the world where people sought not just national independence, but a deeper, more radical transformation of the social order. The Russian Revolution had set off a chain reaction, and it seemed as though no corner of the globe was untouched by its reverberation. However, while the revolution served as a symbol of hope for the oppressed, it also stirred growing suspicion and fear among the established powers of the world. The rise of Stalinism and the increasing authoritarianism within the Soviet Union created a complex global dialogue about the nature of revolution and the role of the state. To some, The Soviet Union was a shining example of the triumph of the people over tyranny, a state that had liberated its workers and peasants from centuries of exploitation. To others, it was a stark warning, a cautionary tale of how revolutions could be hijacked by brutal dictatorships that betrayed the very ideals they had set out to promote. In Western democracies, fear of the spread of communism began to shape political discourse. The Soviet model, once seen as an inspiring alternative to capitalist oppression, now appeared to many as a threat. The Cold War was on the horizon, and with it, an ideological battle that would define much of the 20th century. Governments in the West, particularly the United States, reacted with suspicion and hostility, implementing policies that sought to contain the spread of communist influence. The fear of communism's spread gave rise to military alliances, such as NATO, and shaped the geopolitics of the post-World War II era. Countries aligned themselves either with the capitalist bloc led by the United States or the socialist bloc led by the Soviet Union, and the world seemed divided between two competing ideologies. The Russian Revolution, once a symbol of hope, now became a symbol of division, its legacy wrapped in both admiration and fear. Meanwhile, in the newly decolonizing world, the Russian Revolution served as both a source of inspiration and a cautionary tale. The independence movements of Africa, Asia, and Latin America were often caught between these competing forces, as leaders sought to assert their autonomy from both colonial powers and the growing influence of the Soviet Union. Figures like Jawaharlal Nehru in India and Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana saw the revolution as an example of the potential for the oppressed to rise up against their oppressors. Yet, they also recognized the dangers of becoming too closely aligned with the Soviet Union. Both leaders sought to maintain independence in their own countries, navigating a delicate balance between adopting socialist policies that would address inequality and maintaining distance from Soviet control. In response to the global ideological divide, the non-aligned movement was born. Leaders from newly independent nations sought to create a third path that neither fully aligned with the West nor with the Soviet Union. The non-aligned movement, led by figures like Nehru and Nkrumah, aimed to establish a bloc of nations that could chart their own course, free from the influence of the two superpowers. The Russian Revolution had not only inspired revolutions across the globe, but had also become the touchstone for newly independent countries grappling with the question of how to define themselves in the face of both Western imperialism and Soviet expansion. Culturally, the revolution continued to inspire a global exchange of ideas. Artists, writers, and intellectuals engaged with revolutionary themes, either critiquing or championing the ideas that had emerged in Russia in 1917. In Mexico, the murals of Diego Rivera became powerful symbols of the revolution's ideals, celebrating the labor movement and the power of the working class. Rivera's art, influenced by socialist realism, sought to convey a vision of society where the people's struggles were at the forefront of cultural expression. Across the ocean, in Paris, existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir debated the philosophical implications of revolution, freedom, and human agency, spurred in part by the events of 1917. The revolution was not just a political event. It was a cultural phenomenon that sparked intense intellectual and artistic exchanges, challenging conventional narratives and inspiring new forms of expression. In the United States, too, the revolution found its way into cultural discourse. While many were fearful of the spread of communism, artists and intellectuals on the left saw the revolution as an experiment in human liberation. Writers like John Reed, who had witnessed the revolution firsthand, captured its early idealism and the raw passion of the people who believed in the promise of a new world. The Soviet Union, despite its turn toward authoritarianism under Stalin, continued to serve as a model for radical thinkers who were drawn to its vision of social transformation. The Russian Revolution's legacy, then, was not confined to the borders of the Soviet Union. Its impact rippled through the world, influencing movements and shaping the course of history in ways that were both constructive and destructive. The revolution had sparked a worldwide conversation about power, inequality, and the role of the state in shaping society. It forced people everywhere to confront the question of how to build a just society and what sacrifices were necessary to achieve that vision. But it also raised profound questions about the limits of revolution, about how ideals could be twisted and co-opted by those in power. By the time the revolution's centenary arrived in 2017, the world had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the end of colonialism, and the reshaping of global political and economic systems. The Russian Revolution had been a catalyst for all of these changes, setting the stage for the ideological battles of the 20th century. The legacy of the revolution, in all its contradictions, remained a powerful force in global politics, art, and culture. The Russian Revolution had shown the world the power of ideas to reshape society, but it also demonstrated the dangers of unchecked power and the complexities of human nature. In the end, it left a world forever changed one, where the struggle for equality, justice, and freedom continued to unfold in new and unexpected ways. And as long as the world grappled with the question of how to create a better future, the lessons of the Russian Revolution would continue to resonate, challenging and inspiring those who sought to change the world. As the Russian Revolution unfolded in the early 20th century, one of the most monumental events in history occurred: the fall of the Romanov dynasty. The moment was seismic, not only because it marked the end of the Romanovs' 300-year reign, but because it represented the dissolution of a centuries-old imperial system that had shaped Europe's political landscape for so long. For the people of Russia, the Romanovs were symbols of absolute power, divine right, and unyielding tradition. They were the rulers of the largest empire in the world, presiding over a vast expanse of land, people, and history. But as the revolution gathered momentum, that world, built on privilege, hierarchy, and the oppression of millions, began to crumble. The fall of the Romanovs was more than just the overthrow of a ruling family. It was the end of an entire order. The dynasty's demise was not an isolated event, but a part of a far-reaching shift that changed the balance of power, not just in Russia, but across the globe. The revolution that brought down the Romanovs was, in many ways, the most direct challenge to the imperialist world order that had dominated Europe for centuries. The power structures that had upheld monarchies, empires, and aristocracies were now being dismantled by the collective force of workers, peasants, and soldiers. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which had once been the battle cries of the French Revolution, were now being revived in Russia, spurring a global ideological shift that would reverberate across nations and continents. The Russian Revolution, which began with the promise of a better future, was not without its cost. The bloodshed and sacrifice that accompanied the revolution shaped the world we live in today. It was not just a political upheaval, it was a profound transformation in the way we think about power, justice, and equality. The revolution's triumph was marked by a sense of hope that a new world could be born from the ashes of the old. But it was also a period of immense struggle, as revolutionary ideals clashed with the harsh realities of building a new society. The echoes of this change reverberated across the globe, inspiring uprisings and movements in other countries. In the years following the revolution, the Soviet Union stood as a beacon for those who sought to overthrow oppressive regimes and challenge the injustices of the capitalist world. The ideals of socialism and Marxism, once considered fringe ideas, now gained traction in places as far apart as China, Cuba, and Vietnam. They became the rallying cries for liberation movements around the world, as people began to look to Russia not just for inspiration, but for a practical example of how to topple the old imperialist structures that had dominated their societies for centuries. At the center of this transformation, the Romanovs, once symbols of imperial majesty, were now swept away by the tide of history. Tsar Nicholas II and his family, imprisoned by revolutionaries and ultimately executed in 1918, became tragic figures, a stark reminder of the fragility of power. Their downfall was not simply the fall of a family, but the collapse of an entire system, one that had maintained dominance through force, tradition, and the divine right of kings. The grandeur of the Romanovs' palaces, their wealth, and their unquestioned authority were no match for the revolution's relentless force. The Romanovs, who had once been the epitome of imperial grandeur, now stood as a testament to the impermanence of power, illustrating that no matter how entrenched a dynasty might seem, history can sweep it away in an instant. In the aftermath of the revolution, Russia was left to grapple with its new identity. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, sought to construct a society that was fundamentally different from the old imperial system. They aimed to establish a Marxist state, one where the workers and peasants, the very people who had been oppressed for centuries, would have control over their own destiny. The idea of a classless society, free from the exploitation of capitalists and aristocrats, was the core of the Bolshevik vision. But creating this new world would prove far more difficult than anyone could have imagined. This was a period of profound experimentation and upheaval. The dreams of a new society were in constant tension with the harsh realities of governance. The Soviet Union, born out of revolution and bloodshed, was a state in flux, struggling to implement its ideals while dealing with the practical challenges of war, famine, and economic collapse. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had to contend with internal dissent, external threats, and the immense task of rebuilding a country that had been devastated by decades of war and revolution. The utopia they envisioned seemed far away, and with each passing day, the distance between the dream and reality seemed to grow. Yet, the fall of the Romanovs and the rise of the Bolsheviks marked a turning point, not just for Russia, but for the world. The revolution's triumph signaled the beginning of a new era, one in which the old imperial powers would no longer be able to dominate at will. The Russian Revolution was a global event, a catalyst that triggered movements in other nations, and, in many ways, it reshaped the geopolitics of the 20th century. The revolution taught the world that the struggle for justice and equality is not simply a matter of overthrowing a king or a dictator. It is a process, a long and tumultuous journey that requires continuous reflection and effort. The Russian Revolution was not a one-time event, but a series of ongoing struggles and transformations, a demonstration that revolutions do not happen in a single moment, but unfold over time. They are ongoing processes that require not just a shift in power, but also a shift in thinking, in values, and in the way people relate to each other. The fall of the Romanovs and the subsequent rise of the Bolshevik regime did not mark the end of an era, but the beginning of a new, complex, and turbulent chapter in history. The revolution had laid the groundwork for a new world, but the realization of that world was a continuous struggle. It was a world in which people were forced to confront the ideals of the revolution in the face of power, and in which those in power had to deal with the realities of governing in a world that had been irrevocably changed. As we reflect on the Russian Revolution, it becomes clear that its lessons are not confined to the past. The revolution's triumphs and its tragedies still resonate today. The revolution's ideals of justice, equality, and freedom are still as relevant now as they were then, as people around the world continue to fight for the same principles. The struggle to create a fairer, more just society is ongoing, and the lessons of the revolution remain a powerful reminder of the challenges that come with seeking radical change. The fall of the Romanovs was not just the end of one dynasty, it was the beginning of a new world order, one that would continue to evolve in the decades to come. It was a world where power was no longer seen as the divine right of kings, but as something to be claimed by the people. The revolution's ultimate legacy lies in its ability to challenge long-standing systems of inequality and to inspire those who continue to dream of a world in which justice and equality are not just ideals, but lived realities. The lessons of the Russian Revolution, its triumphs, its failures, its sacrifices, remain as pertinent today as ever. It is a reminder that revolutions are not simple solutions to complex problems, but ongoing struggles that require constant effort and reflection. The revolution may have started with the fall of the Romanovs, but it continues to unfold in the hearts and minds of those who still believe in the possibility of a better world. And as we look to the future, the lessons of the past urge us to continue to ask, how can we, in our own time, shape a more just and equitable future? As we reach the conclusion of this journey through the Russian Revolution, we are left with a profound question that echoes through history. What can we learn from this monumental period? The revolution was born from a deep desire for justice, a yearning to dismantle an unjust system that had oppressed millions for centuries. But it was also marked by violence, repression, and betrayal elements that tarnished its ideals and complicated its legacy. The lessons of the Russian Revolution are not just about the triumph of the people or the birth of a new world. They are also about the dangers of idealism, unchecked by wisdom, compassion, and respect for human life. The revolution, as we know, was not a simple or linear path. It began with the hope of creating a just society, but soon spiraled into a period marked by internal conflict, civil war, and the rise of an authoritarian regime under Stalin. The early days of the revolution saw the promise of a classless society, where power would belong to the workers and peasants, but as history unfolded, it became clear that the road to such a society would be fraught with contradictions, unforeseen consequences, and moral compromises. The Bolsheviks, driven by their vision of a new world, had to contend with forces both external and internal, and in the end, their success in establishing the Soviet Union came at a staggering human cost. The Russian Revolution teaches us that the road to change is never simple. In fact, it is often perilous, filled with unforeseen consequences, and requires constant reflection. The revolution's ideals, justice, equality, and freedom, were powerful, and they inspired millions to rise up and demand a better world. But the question remains, how do we ensure that revolutionary ideals do not descend into violence and authoritarianism? The revolution's ultimate failure to uphold its early promises of freedom and democracy serves as a powerful reminder that no movement, no matter how noble its intentions, is immune to corruption and distortion. The path to change must be navigated carefully, with constant vigilance and reflection. One of the most powerful lessons we can draw from the Russian Revolution is the reminder that the power of ideas is immense. A single idea can inspire millions to act, to challenge the established order, to dream of a better world. The revolution, with all its tumult and chaos, proves that the power of ideas can reshape the course of history. The ideals of the Russian Revolution did not just influence the course of Russian history, they set off a wave of political thought and action across the globe. From China to Cuba, from Vietnam to Africa, the revolution's ideals became a source of inspiration for movements seeking to overthrow imperialism, colonialism, and the entrenched power structures of their own countries. But while the revolution reminds us of the immense power of ideas, it also serves as a cautionary tale. Ideas alone cannot sustain a revolution. They must be tempered with wisdom, a deep respect for human life, and an understanding of the complexities of governance. The Bolsheviks were driven by a clear vision, but as they moved to implement their ideals, they found themselves increasingly relying on force, repression, and terror. The ideals of justice and equality became subverted as Stalin and others in power used the machinery of the state to suppress opposition, eliminate perceived threats, and maintain control. This shift from idealism to authoritarianism is perhaps the most tragic aspect of the revolution. It shows us that without the wisdom to balance ideals with pragmatic governance, even the most noble aspirations can turn into a nightmare. The lessons of the Russian Revolution remind us that, while passion for change is vital, it must be paired with pragmatism. Revolutionary movements must balance their fervor with a realistic understanding of how power works and how it can be wielded responsibly. In the pursuit of justice, it is crucial that we do not allow our ideals to lead us into chaos. The revolutionaries in Russia started with the best of intentions, but as they navigated the complex realities of statecraft, they fell into the trap of sacrificing their principles for the sake of maintaining power. The result was a government that, while theoretically dedicated to creating a better world, became one of the most brutal regimes in modern history. To avoid this fate, the lessons of the revolution call for leaders and citizens alike to engage in open dialogue and reflect on the ethical implications of their actions. The Russian Revolution serves as a powerful reminder that revolution is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process that requires constant reflection. A society built on justice, equality, and freedom can only be achieved when we listen to diverse perspectives and consider the consequences of our actions. It is crucial that revolutionary movements remain grounded in the values they claim to uphold, ensuring that the methods used to achieve change do not undermine the very ideals they seek to establish. Moreover, the revolution underscores the importance of vigilance. As agents of change, we must be ever watchful of the signs of authoritarianism and work tirelessly to protect civil liberties. In Russia, the fall of the Romanovs and the rise of the Bolsheviks led to the emergence of a government that was initially hailed as a victory for the people. But the centralization of power in the hands of a single party, the suppression of political dissent, and the use of terror to enforce ideological conformity ultimately betrayed the revolution's original goals. The lesson here is clear. Power is dangerous, and it is easy for those in charge to justify authoritarian measures in the name of protecting the revolution. The key to avoiding such a fate is the constant protection of democratic principles, the right to dissent, and the preservation of civil liberties. As we reflect on the lessons of the Russian Revolution, it becomes evident that the struggle for a better world is ongoing. The revolution may have occurred over a century ago, but its lessons are still incredibly relevant today. Around the world, people continue to fight for justice, equality, and freedom. From grassroots movements to political revolutions, the fight for a fairer society remains at the forefront of global politics. But we must ask ourselves, can we avoid the mistakes of the past? Can we build a future where power is not concentrated in the hands of a few, but shared among the many? Can we create a society where justice is not merely an ideal but a living, breathing reality? The Russian Revolution teaches us that we must strive for progress while remaining mindful of the ethical implications of our actions. The revolution was born out of a desire for justice, but the pursuit of justice cannot come at the expense of the very values that make it meaningful: democracy, freedom, and human dignity. The road to a just society is fraught with challenges, contradictions, and setbacks. But if we approach it with wisdom, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to the principles of justice, we can continue to build a better world. In the end, the lessons of the Russian Revolution are a call to action. They urge us to continue striving for a world that reflects the best of our shared humanity. They remind us that revolution is not just about the overthrow of governments or systems, but about the ongoing struggle to create a society that upholds the dignity and rights of every individual. As we look to the future, we must keep the lessons of the past in mind, ensuring that our passion for change does not blind us to the complexities of governance. Through empathy, collaboration, and a steadfast commitment to justice, we can continue the journey toward a more equitable and compassionate world, one that reflects the ideals of the revolution, but also learns from its mistakes. The future, as always, remains unwritten, and it is up to us to shape it with care, thoughtfulness, and a deep respect for the human spirit. The Russian Revolution, a world born of blood and ideals, forever altered the course of history. It was a seismic event that reshaped not only Russia, but the entire geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. The fall of the Romanovs, the bloody overthrow of centuries-old empires, the rise of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, followed by the rise of Stalin's iron-fisted rule, all of it marked the beginning of an era that would influence generations of revolutionaries, policymakers, and thinkers. Yet, as we stand in the present and look back at the revolutionary legacy, we are left with a set of crucial questions. Was the Russian Revolution a victory for the people, or did it pave the way for new forms of tyranny? This is not an easy question to answer, nor should it be. History is never simple. It is never just black and white. The Russian Revolution, like all revolutions, is a story told through myriad perspectives. The revolution was both a triumph of human aspiration and a tragedy that caused untold suffering. It is a tale of workers seizing control of factories, peasants fighting for land, and soldiers throwing off the shackles of imperialism. But it is also the story of a brutal civil war, of a repressive regime, and of the rise of Stalinism, a system that stifled freedoms in the name of creating a better world. As we reflect on the revolution's legacy, we must remember that history is a tapestry woven from countless experiences, perspectives, and voices. These voices are not always the ones that dominate the grand narratives, those of the leaders, the generals, the politicians, but they are equally important. The revolution didn't just belong to Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. It belonged to the workers, the intellectuals, the soldiers, and the peasants. Their experiences, often overshadowed in the histories written by the victors, offer crucial insights into the human cost of the revolution, its triumphs, and its betrayals. Take, for example, the workers who played such a pivotal role in the revolution's early stages. The factories in Petrograd, the heart of revolutionary fervor, were filled with men and women who worked long hours in deplorable conditions. Many of them rose up in protest, not out of ideological fervor, but out of sheer desperation. Their struggles were at the very core of the revolution. But what happened to them once the revolution succeeded? How did they experience the aftermath of the Soviet government's promises? Were their lives truly transformed, or did they find themselves caught in the gears of a new system that was as exploitative, if not more so, than the one it replaced? Similarly, the soldiers who fought in the trenches of the Great War, and later in the Civil War, had their own stories to tell. To them, the revolution was a means to escape the horrors of war, to fight for a world that would end their suffering. But as they became pawns in a larger political struggle, they were also subject to the harsh realities of Bolshevik rule. The promises of peace, bread, and land were alluring, but were they realized in the ways the revolutionaries had hoped? How did the soldiers who fought for the revolution feel about the rise of Stalinism, the purges, and the suppression of their voices? And then there are the intellectuals, the idealists, who played a critical role in articulating the vision of the revolution. Many of them were inspired by Marxist theory and saw the revolution as the dawn of a new era. But as the revolution morphed into a totalitarian regime, how did they respond? Some, like Trotsky, fought to the end, believing that the revolution could still fulfill its promises. Others fell victim to Stalin's purges, their ideas silenced, their lives destroyed. Their stories are often lost in the larger historical narrative, but they too offer valuable lessons. And of course, we must not forget the peasants who were at the heart of the revolution. Land redistribution was one of the key promises of the Bolshevik movement. And yet, as the revolution progressed, peasants found themselves caught between competing visions of what that promise meant. Forced collectivization under Stalin caused widespread suffering, leading to famine, death, and displacement. But how did the peasants experience the early days of the revolution, before the state imposed its own vision of agriculture? For many, the hope of a better future turned into something far darker, as the government's policies betrayed their dreams of land and independence. These are just a few of the countless voices that we must seek out to fully understand the impact of the revolution. The lessons of the past cannot be learned through the lens of a single story. To truly understand the Russian Revolution and its legacy, we must engage with the diverse array of literature, documentaries, and academic works that explore its many facets. We must immerse ourselves in the stories of those who lived through it, from all walks of life, workers, soldiers, intellectuals, peasants, and consider their experiences and their struggles. In doing so, we must not just passively consume these narratives, but actively engage with them. We must participate in discussions, whether in academic settings or in community forums, to explore differing viewpoints and broaden our understanding. The Russian Revolution is not just a historical event. It is a lens through which we can examine the complexities of power, justice, and human rights in any society. What can we learn from the mistakes and successes of the revolution? How can we apply those lessons to the struggles for freedom and equality happening today? As we contemplate the lessons of the Russian Revolution, we are reminded that the pursuit of justice is always a delicate balance. The revolution was born out of a desire for change, for a society in which power would be shared by the people. But it was also marked by violence, betrayal, and the subjugation of the very ideals it claimed to uphold. The rise of Stalinism, with its brutal repression and cult of personality, stands as a stark reminder that power, when unchecked, can easily corrupt even the noblest of causes. The revolution, while achieving some of its goals, also paved the way for the very forms of tyranny it sought to dismantle. Yet, despite these flaws, the revolution's impact cannot be denied. It changed the world. It shifted the balance of power, and it inspired generations of activists, intellectuals, and revolutionaries to continue the fight for a just society. But it also teaches us that the journey toward justice is never straightforward. It requires constant reflection, vigilance, and a willingness to question even the most cherished beliefs. Revolution is not a single event, but an ongoing process that demands sacrifice, resilience, and a commitment to the principles of human dignity. So, as we turn the pages of history and reflect on the Russian Revolution, we must ask ourselves, what is the legacy we wish to leave? What can we learn from the triumphs and failures of the past to shape a more just and equitable future? The lessons of the revolution are as relevant today as they were a century ago. The pursuit of justice and equality is an ongoing struggle, one that demands our attention and our action. We cannot afford to forget the lessons of the past, for they are the keys to understanding the challenges of the present and the future. As we move forward, let us not simply be passive observers of history, but active participants in shaping the world around us. Let us continue to learn from the past, to engage with the stories of those who came before us, and to push forward in the pursuit of a society that reflects the best of our shared humanity. The Russian Revolution may have been a world-changing event, but its legacy is not just a thing of the past. It is alive in the struggles we face today, in the movements for justice, and in the ongoing quest for a more equitable world. Let us honor the lessons of the revolution by carrying them forward into the future, and by ensuring that the fight for justice and equality remains at the heart of everything we do. Ultimately, the legacy of the Russian Revolution serves as a poignant reminder of the power of collective action and the complex interplay between ideals and reality. As we continue to grapple with issues of social justice and governance today, let us draw lessons from the past to inform our actions moving forward. Your voice matters in this ongoing dialogue, so share your thoughts, challenge assumptions, and contribute to building a future that honors the lessons of history while striving for a more equitable and just world. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Leave your thoughts in the comments and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories from history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.